Okay, so the second article that we're going to talk about today is written by Kimmel and Coston, who are sociologists, and they're talking about the idea of male privilege. So, privilege, they open the article talking about Peggy McIntosh's really famous article, Male Privilege. Wait, what was that? What the heck is the name of her article? I can't remember, but it's a very famous article that I've also taught. And in it, she uses the analogy of the invisible knapsack. So we talk a lot in our culture right now about privilege, about gender privilege, about racial privilege, economic privilege. And Peggy McIntosh in the 80s broke that down and said that what privilege is an invisible knapsack where you carry like all of these things that allow you to move through the world easier. And she says invisible because typically the argument that she makes and that most people now make is that privilege is invisible to the person that has it. So
right.
Often you have all of these like doors open to you because you have a certain amount of privilege, but you don't notice that because you don't see the ways in which they're closed to other people who don't have your same privileges.
Yeah, absolutely. And if I recall correctly, part of what McIntosh was doing was trying to translate a lot of the insights of feminism more broadly to other kinds of categories like race and class. Yeah, race particularly, and say, hey, like, you know, there are ways in which like we focused a lot on how women are oppressed and the obstacles there are for you know, women's advancement or for women to achieve the kinds of things that they wish to achieve. But, you know, there are many ways in which we have advantages that are invisible to us, but that are real obstacles for people of color.
Yeah.
And maybe we need to step back and have kind of a theory that can more broadly address the way in which there are obstacles that exist for people based on different kind of classes that they fall into.
Yeah, and one of the things that she did that I really appreciated is try to make those invisible things visible by creating a huge long list, a laundry list of what sort of privileges as a white woman that she had. And they range from the very highly oppressive structures to the very mundane that you don't think about.
Right.
For example, as a white woman, I can walk into any drugstore and find foundation that matches my skin color, or my kids can go to school in which their own like history as white people is reflected in everyday classes and things like that. So they start off talking about her and talking about this invisible knapsack of privilege and saying that typically when we have these conversations, we talk about men as holding all of these privileges.
That's right. And in general, that we tend to talk about these different kinds of privileges in isolation with one another. And of course, not long after, right around the time that McIntosh was writing about this invisible knapsack concept, we also started to get another concept sort of related to privilege, which is intersectionality.
Okay, I actually didn't know what you were going to say. That was like a surprise.
Surprise! But it is in the title, the intersectionality of privilege. So
I just wasn't inside your head.
But no, it's really important because it's it's not enough to just think about these different forms of privilege and oppression in isolation from one another, but we have to think about the ways in which they intersect and where having multiple kinds of privileges can really, you know, create opportunities or advantages for you, and having multiple kinds of or oppression or lacking certain privileges can really create even deeper obstacles. Some people like to say these privileges aren't just additive or subtractive, but they're like multiplicative.
Yeah.
You know, they have kind of an exponential effect on one another, and so that's what the authors are trying to get at in this piece, but particularly in the context of masculinity, and particularly looking at, well, what if we examine men who, on the one hand, are privileged because they are men, but on the other hand, have a status that
diminishes that privilege.
Diminishes that privilege, or causes them to experience obstacles in their life, or to be oppressed in certain ways. And what if we...
not just obstacles in their lives, because one of the things that like Marilyn Frye would talk about is that you can have difficulties in your life without being oppressed. Right?
That's right.
So that's, Marilyn Frye in a text called What is Oppression famously said, if I'm a, white South African wealthy person who's skiing and I fall down the hill and I break my leg, that's the example that she gives. That sucks because it's painful to break your leg, but it's not oppressive.
Right.
So...
And I should be clear, when I'm saying obstacles, and I absolutely agree, what I'm implying is that these obstacles are systematic.
Right,
and that they're created by institutions or social structures in our world, essentially to disadvantage certain groups of people and not other groups of people. And though we may experience those as obstacles individually, when we step back, we see that it's systematic.
I knew. I just wanted to make that clear.
Absolutely. It's an extremely important point, and I think we should be clear to make that distinction between
and I think so too, because I think that's something that people often miss. So you hear people who have like a fairly high degree of privilege saying like, actually, I'm not that privileged because, this and this and this was hard for me.
Right.
And that's a misunderstanding of what it is that we're talking about when we're talking about privilege and oppression.
Absolutely.
So I think one of the important things that they do after they are kind of laying all of that out is talking about stigma and how stigma operates.
Mm-hmm. And they're drawing on a famous sociologist, Goffman, that's right, and who was, despite my pause because I'm blanking on his first name, Irvin Goffman.
Irving or Irwin? Irving?
Yeah.
Irving Goffman
is one of my favorites, and really helps sort of define what stigma is. And he talks about stigma as a stain, a mark, a quote spoiled identity. And it's an attribute that changes you from a whole and usual person to a tainted and discounted one. And I should say that when it changes you in other people's perception. So we're not talking about that stigma actually fundamentally changes who you are, or that having one of these stigmatized attributes necessarily changes how you feel about yourself.
But it does change how you have to interact
exactly,
with the world.
And how others tend to perceive you. And that's actually an important point, because we're going to come back to...
Yeah, right after, I just want to interject because you were reading from this section where the next sentence, right after what you said, is people with stigmatized attributes are constantly practicing various strategies to ensure minimal damage. It's really interesting. I think that that's absolutely true. And people who don't have stigmatized identities don't recognize that.
Right.
Yesterday I was interviewing a woman who, for a piece I'm writing, I was interviewing a woman who trained medical professionals to deal with sex workers, how to talk to sex workers, which is a stigmatized identity. And one of the things that she said is she had to train both sex workers in how to call medical professionals and make sure that they were people who were sex worker affirming, but then also... And that's exactly what they're talking about. So if you're not in a stigmatized identity, you don't need training on how to have strategies to ensure like you're going to get care. So there's something that seems exactly
right. And it's once again going back to that privilege, and there is a strong linkage between stigmatization and privilege or oppression. Stigma causes you to be oppressed. Stigmatized people experience oppression in the world,
right?
And the flip side of that is
to navigate the world in ways that privileged people don't have to navigate.
Exactly, and so being able to call the doctor without first having to screen them to determine whether or not they're going to discriminate you or systematically discount what you're experiencing is an invisible form of privilege that many of us may experience, but sex workers and probably lots of other people who inhabit, stigmatized or
poor
oppressed
people.
categories often are not afforded that same luxury, are not trusted by their doctors, or are not respected, or not considered to have good judgment. And that then ultimately affects the quality of care that they receive. So Goffman suggests 3 different strategies that stigmatized people use to deal with the stigma that they experience in the world, or use to negotiate the stigmatized identities. And we don't want to talk about these too long, but we could list them off.
Sure, yeah. So the first one is menstrualization, coming from like the history of menstrual performers. Black people, African American people, performers who overact the stereotypes of what it is that like a black person is, or
what it is that how white people perceive like, black people.
And I think that that's actually an important thing. So what they're suggesting as one of the strategies is overemphasizing that. So whatever it is that people believe you to be, to play into that. And typically what they're arguing is that you play into it in order to somehow get what you want. So it's like the damsel in distress.
Right, is another example. Might play up their helplessness in order to get somebody to do something. If they're on the side of the road, or to get out of a ticket from a cop, or if they need someone to help change the tire or something like that, they may, in order to get what they want.
Right.
Though
and
perhaps
what they argue here, I think that's important, is like, well, most people who are doing this are very aware of the fact that they're doing it and that it's a strategy. So they say minstrels exaggerate difference in the face of those with more power. So not for their own peer group, but for other people with more power. When they are with other stigmatized people, they may laugh about the fact that the powerful actually think we're like this. That's often one sort of power that they feel they have.
Right, and I think actually that's important as well, because like the examples I gave are pretty isolated, though I mean obviously a relationship with a cop tends to be a power relation, but we may talk about playing up helplessness in the context of a marriage example, or in in school setting or something where women have to systematically interact with men who may have more power or privilege than they do, and in order to negotiate it or to sort of secure what they need, they may have to perform the damsel in distress and
or the happy-go-lucky African American performer,
right, or the campy gay man. Right. There are cases in which, like, in all of these cases, the suggestion is that by fitting into and overplaying that stereotype, they are somehow perceived as safe or intelligible to people in power, and therefore may receive better treatment if they resist those stereotypes. But on the other hand, it's suggested that this is a strategy that makes sense when you are really powerless or isolated from other people like you. But comes at a great cost of really having to live a double life and conceal maybe how you really feel about yourself.
Right.
And so we can look at these other strategies.
So normification is one that they used. Norm just being like trying to assert or asserting that you are just the same as the people who are in power. So if I'm a powerless person, or I'm in some sort of marginalized group, I could say like, actually, I'm just the same as you. You just don't recognize that. So instead of like playing up difference, you're instead trying to collapse those differences to fit in.
Right, and that was, that was a debate, for example, within the kind of gay rights and marriage equality movement. You had a lot of people that might be like, hey, we're family people like anyone else. We have children. We have our suburban home.
House and,
We just want to live a life. We just happen to be, 2 men or 2 women, and then there are other folks who are like, screw the institution of marriage.
Yeah.
And we shouldn't have to conform to these like white suburban
Yeah.
middle class ideals in order to be recognized.
Right. And that actually may fall into this like militant chauvinism,
which is the third reaction.
Yeah. Okay, I'll talk. So the militant chauvinism, they list like Afrocentrism, Nation of Islam, or like Black Panther parties as examples of this. I think lesbian separatists can also be considered like an example of this.
Right.
But the idea with militant chauvinism is if you have a group that's large enough to somehow separate off from that like norm culture, then you can assert like the superiority of your own group and just not play into that.
Right. Yeah, and try to exist separately from the
And,
dominant culture.
Yeah, but also to assert that like your political standing or your particular group is better than the dominant culture.
Right, which is why you stand apart from
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so let's move on. Those are the strategies for dealing with stigma. Unless you want to say something else about it.
No. So in this article they talk about 3 distinct groups of men that are stigmatized in some way or that are oppressed in some way. Talk about disabled men, gay men, and working class men.
Yeah. There were some things that they said in here that I hadn't thought about before. Maybe perhaps because I am coming from such a feminist perspective that I think less about masculinity, although I'm thinking more and more about it like as of late. But some of the things were new to me as I went through and read this, which is always kind of fun. So first they talked about disabled men, and how part of masculinity or the idea of masculinity is having like all of this like prowess, right?
Yeah.
And power and like physical power. And that if you're physically disabled, that diminishes that status.
Right, and they cite a few examples of disabled men who talk about engaging in competitive sports or do some sort of activity, athletic activity that kind of, in a way, is meant to compensate for the kinds of limits that they experience, and or engage in risk-taking activities or other kinds of things that show their bravery or their strength, or basically try to affirm the kind of masculine characteristics that they feel might be threatened or in question.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And so that would, I think, fall into kind of the normification.
Yeah. They also said, though, that there's ways in which people have done something that, or disabled men have done something that look more like menstrualization, though, in that they've kind of played up or overemphasized their disabled status as a way of dealing with other people doing that.
Right, absolutely. And I think we could imagine cases in which you have a third category as well of militant chauvinism. I think particularly now with the internet, where you have the capacity for like large numbers of people to
collectivize.
Collectivize, and even if they don't like live apart, still being able to have a space for conversation separate from like the dominant power structures in society, may at least allow people to assert that, like, hey, we have experiences or understanding that these folks are ignorant to, and to some degree, at least you could imagine where some of that, and all of this exists on a scale, so maybe it's not the same thing as like building a separate society, but having a separate space to have conversations at least that you think are superior to kind of the understanding that
normies have.
Right. May in some ways echo that kind of militant chauvinism.
Yeah. Gay men was a second example that they gave. They actually talked a lot about the effeminate movement, which I didn't
Yeah,
know.
I learned about that too. That
I
was
didn't
new
know
to me,
about that.
actually.
I thought it was really interesting that there was a whole movement post Stonewall during the gay liberation movement called effeminism. And the reason that I bring this up and how it's related is they were talking about how gay men or male homosexuality is something that's stigmatized because up until like the 80s actually,
Yeah, like late 70s.
most men who identified, at least in Western culture, as gay were more effeminate. So,
or at least that was the perception.
sure.
And then there was a strong backlash.
Right, which is like the
kind of like leather culture and such.
Yeah.
That really, really tried to masculinize
right.
gay male culture.
Yeah.
That there was a cultural moment in which those kinds of identities, even like bike gangs and that sort of thing.
Speaking of which, I was on Instagram last night and I found Dan Savage's husband. He's like a perfect example of this.
Oh, really?
He is so like buff and plays up on that. Like that's all of his Instagram is like his very masculine presentation.
Right. No, that's interesting. And there's, we had scholar Gail Rubin was in at the university last year talking about the history of that culture and how it, there were lots of bars that were really in magazines and even camps and events that were really focused to this hyper masculine gay culture.
Right.
And this feminist culture
right.
Was a reaction to that, to say, hey, like, let's carve out space. We too, even if we are men who don't occupy like a kind of hyper masculine image, gay men who are more effeminate still deserve rights and recognition.
Sure, yeah.
And that was kind of the pushback to say, like, we don't need to be hyper masculine in order to be valued or treated with respect in society.
Yeah.
At least that's how I read it.
Yeah. That's exactly how I read it. That, now I actually really want to read the Feminist Manifesto, which I guess is something that like came out, but that was the same idea. Yeah, the feminists pointed to the possibilities for a liberated masculinity offered by feminism. So there was like a mapping on of like this feminist movement, obviously, onto the feminist movement. They argued feminism, they argued as a positive political position, aligning anti-sexist gay men with women instead of claiming male privilege by asserting their difference from women. So what they're arguing, what this feminist like movement is arguing, is that what these like hyper masculine gay men did was try to differentiate themselves from women by like highly aligning themselves with straight men and like the masculine ideal of what that would look like. And the pushback of feminism was to say, actually, I'd rather politically align with feminists than
macho.
Than macho-ness.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Yeah. But they're both, I think, one of the things that they're pointing out in this article is both of those are coping strategies.
They are, and
of how to deal with stigma.
Yeah, and that's interesting because, I mean, clearly, like, the machoization of gay men, like that machismo movement seems to fit that normalization.
Right.
I don't know about, I mean, does the feminism fit, like...
It actually may be like the chauvinist.
Or is it a minstrel, or is it both?
Yeah.
I mean, I think we might say, hey, well, this may be a case where maybe that categorization breaks down a little bit, or overlaps, or, it's a little of column A and a little of column B, like, and to some degree it's like a playing up of these attributes that are rejected or disdained by sort of dominant culture. But on the other hand, maybe it's also a little bit stepping back and saying, like, actually we're doing this and we're better.
Yeah.
And I mean, if you have a manifesto, right? Like that seems to be different than this kind of isolated minstrelizing. It's really trying to build a political identity against the dominant. So it seems to me like it's a little of both, but I guess that's open to interpretation.
Yep. And then the last one is working class men. What they're arguing here, and I think this is fairly interesting, is that working class men actually fit the stereotype of masculinity in a lot of concrete ways, but then not in other ways. So
Yes.
they fit it in the sense that they are hardworking and physical, so usually like stronger. So people who are in trades, people who are working, who are doing construction or labor. So in that regard, like there's a hyper masculinity that goes with working class men, but they don't have the same sort of political or economic advantages that white collar men do.
Yeah, and I think specifically, like they try to break that down, and they say, first off, they're expendable, right?
Yeah.
And that kind of like the interchangeability or the way that working class people are treated as expendable, that seems to be an affront to their masculinity or their status.
Yeah.
Then they also suggest that they're often imagined to be dumb brutes in the same way.
Yeah, they drew this really interesting parallel that I hadn't thought about on page 27. He says, working class men are the male equivalent of the dumb blonde, endowed with physical virtues, but problematized by intellectual shortcomings.
Right, exactly. And I think that both that expendability and brutishness kind of are meant to differentiate from the middle and upper class men who ultimately wield a different kind of power or have a different kind of respect in society. And what I thought was maybe the most significant thing that they suggested, or the thing that kind of really clarified it to me, was when they mentioned that working class fathers, they said that upper and middle class fathers tend to raise their kids to be like themselves and see it as their job to pass on their own values and position, whereas lower class fathers tend to see themselves as negative role models,
right,
and to suggest to their kids that they ought to grow beyond them, or to be socially mobile past them, or to learn from my mistakes, or don't be like me, don't make my mistakes.
One of the things that they said that I thought was super interesting was that if the kids did not go on to, get a college education or become more like upwardly mobile than their parents, then those fathers saw that as a failure on both of their parts. So It was a failure of the father for not pushing presumably they're talking about their sons to like succeed, but maybe their daughters as well. And it was also a failing of the child who didn't like take the lessons of the father.
And so I thought that was all really interesting and perhaps particularly relevant in light of the last election, where the idea of the white working class was such a contested topic. People, on the one hand you had Trump appealing to the white working class, on the other hand you had a lot of people on the left, particularly people of color, arguing that doesn't exist, or that's like that we shouldn't reify that construction, meaning we shouldn't like talk about it in a way that like reinforces the idea that it exists.
Well, one of the things that they said that was interesting as well is that in an effort for men who feel disempowered because of their like social and economic standing, one of the ways in which to reaffirm their own sort of power is to be more chauvinistic in their households.
Right, and because that's a thing that they can share in common with middle and upper class men is
like power over women. So
and children.
Yeah.
But to exercise that power within the home. Is in a weird sense a solidarity with men
maleness.
Of higher position.
Right. Yeah, so I think that
and just to make a quick credit, that's also a form of normification then.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I think that's a
And
good way.
right, to say that I control my wife and children,
Yeah.
just in the way that middle and upper class men do, is a form of normification. Whereas there's also chauvinistic responses, which are the sort of rallying around in certain spaces and sort of like pool halls or motorcycle clubs or what certain bars, and also critiquing sort of the limp-wristed, middle management yes man,
which is more chauvinistic. Yeah.
And then finally you have, I think, also possibly an idea of minstrelization that you could imagine as certain. I think we get a lot in media.
Yeah, like Al Bundy.
Yeah, Al Bundy or Archie Bunker, though, we could also say, actually, those are those are upper and middle class constructs of working class necks that are being acted out by people who aren't, in fact, working class.
Yeah.
And so, but to the degree that one chooses to embody those kinds of images and represent themselves in accordance with those tropes, then that would be maybe minstrelization.
Yeah. Yeah, so to sum up, the point of this article, the conclusion that they make is that, like, privilege, when we're talking about male privilege, isn't monolith, is what they say. It's unevenly distributed. So while we can say that, by and large, men have more privilege over women, and that is, like, true, that's uncontestedly true, it's also more complicated than that. So just like in the first article when we were talking about how sex is actually more, like sex designations is more complicated, privilege is also complicated by a variety of factors.
Right, and I think it would, again, to boil that down, perhaps, the takeaway from that is, before we say all men or all women and make those kinds of generalizations, or to say things that imply that, we should think about the way that these other categories intersect. And do all people in these different gender categories really experience privilege and oppression in the same way? Is there a universal experience there? Or do these other sorts of categories, when they intersect with gender, shape the experience of either privilege or oppression in a way that, like you said, again, means that we can't just speak.
We can't universalize.
We can't say there's a common experience that all men and all women have. And I think that's really tricky, because I think that sometimes those generalizations are useful, and like you said, we can talk usefully about men in society having power with respect to women. But then, there's also instances in where maybe it's useful to look at that on more of a granular level and understand, that different categories of men relate differently to the world, to women, to every, and
to work, to parenting, to all sorts of things.
Right. And so it's a matter of, in my opinion, kind of being able to do both, and to move from kind of different positions of understanding or different viewpoints.
It actually seems like that's kind of the theme of today, though, because we were saying the same thing with Anne Fousteau Sterling. So when you have these camps, these dualistic camps of men, women, essentialism, constructionism, nature, nurture, what we're actually trying to do in this course, but also in these two texts, is to suggest that everything is a bit messier than that, and probably there's some sort of complicated interplay between all of these things.
Yeah. And perhaps to say that, it may be difficult for us to throw out those categories entirely, but we should also, I think, take them with a grain of salt, or understand that often, like you said, they're messier or more interconnected than they are completely disparate. Or in the case of this reading, that they intersect with other things in ways that, make it perhaps overly simplistic to only look at that one binary.
Absolutely. I think that's a wrap.
All right. Well, that's day one.
Day one.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.